Welcome, everyone. This is our first International Women's Day event for 2022. So, on behalf of the Advocates for Human Rights, I'd like to welcome all of you. We will wait for just a couple of minutes as I see people are joining us. So, we'll just wait for another minute or so. Okay, well, why don't we get started? We have a lot to discuss today, so I don't want to delay any longer. But again, thank you so much for joining us for this International Women's Day event. We're kicking off the celebration at the Advocates for Human Rights this week with a discussion about violence against women in Colombia. My name is Jennifer Prestolt, and I am Deputy Director at the Advocates. I direct our International Justice Program, and I had the very good fortune to be able to work closely with our speakers today on our international advocacy to change laws and practices in Colombia to better protect women and girls from violence. So, just a couple of quick housekeeping matters. One standard CLE credit has been applied for this. The code will be posted on our website once that has been approved. In addition, we will have about 30 minutes of presentation followed by a moderated Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation. We're using the webinar format on Zoom, so I will be posing those questions to our speakers, but you can certainly enter your questions as they arise in your mind. And then the materials for the CLE are on our website, and so my colleague Katya will be putting that link in the chat as well. But you can take a look at the the submission that we made to the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the one pager, and then there's some additional materials in Spanish about the law. So let me quickly do an introduction of our wonderful panelists today. I'll start with Dr. Greta Friedemann Sanchez, who's a native of Colombia, an associate professor at the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Minnesota, and she completed her postdoctoral training at the Center for Chronic Disease Outcomes Research, VA Medical Center. Dr. Friedemann Sanchez's research portfolio aims to understand how and why gender equity or inequity is generated inside of families. Retiring from a successful career as a financial services lawyer to manage her family's business interests, Margaret Peggy Grieve went on to earn a master's in public affairs at the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota, with a minor in human rights and a certificate in nonprofit management. There she began her research collaboration with Dr. Greta Friedemann Sanchez, which led to the public scholarship research project that we'll be discussing today, and a recently published book in 2019, and most recently in August of 2021, Colombia's Passage of Law 2126. And that is a huge accomplishment that improves access to justice for women victims of domestic violence. Peggy serves on the board of the Advocates for Human Rights, as well as the Child Mind Institute and the Central Asia America Education Foundation. So welcome to our speakers. Unfortunately, Greta is feeling ill today, so she will cede the microphone or cede the floor, as we say at the United Nations, to Peggy to do most of the presentation and then participate as able during the Q&A. So welcome to everyone, and I will turn the floor over to Peggy and share my screen.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I apologize in advance. I will not be as brilliant a presenter as Greta will be, but I will try and do my best. Slide. I want to start first with a few acknowledgments, because our research and our success wouldn't have been possible without the help first of the advocates for human rights, and we'll talk more about that, as well as a Human Rights Initiative grant from the University of Minnesota, which helped us with our advocacy at the UN and the publication in our books, and foremost with the gracious support of the family commissioners in Colombia, about which you'll hear more, who shared the wealth of information that provided the on-the-ground information that led to our recommendations and advocacy. Slide. Greta, as a Latina scholar in the US, feels a huge ethical responsibility to engage in applied public scholarship. As an academic, it is very important to engage in research, but applied public scholarship is something more than merely being an expert in research theory, methodology, and publication. It goes beyond that. It seeks to actually improve the lives of people through the research work conducted on the ground on topics that are timely and relevant to communities. It means embracing people on the ground with relevant topics, and also considering, which is a little bit different for academics, how to publish those results and make them accessible to the people that you are seeking to engage in the research, and giving them the tools of the results of your research so that they can improve their lives. As a minimum, it means repatriating the results of your research, which is why we published our book in Spanish. But it also means engaging the community for change, which is why we went to the UN and also worked in Colombia, which you'll hear more about that. The project, as Jennifer indicated, tackles the issue of intimate partner violence in Colombia. Slide. But first, in order to understand the project, you have to understand a little bit about Colombia, which has been engaged in years and years, more than 5 decades, of internal armed conflict among various factions. In 2016, they reached a landmark peace agreement with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as the FARC, which had engaged in years of guerrilla fighting, which was known for its violence. But the FARC were not the only ones engaged in this fighting. There was also another group, the Ejército Nacional de Liberación, or National Liberation Army, or ELN, which did not stop fighting. And previously, there had been a right-wing group known as the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUCA, which had demobilized in 2006. And they were also known for their violence. All of these groups engaged in criminal activity to support either their guerrilla activity or, when they demobilized, their lifestyle. The criminal activity included drug trafficking, illegal mining, and other kidnapping. And as they have demobilized, the organized crime continues to grow, and it revolves around drugs, arms, human trafficking, and illegal mining. Slide. Although we all think we know what domestic violence looks like, it is much more brutal in the context of armed conflict. And the armed conflict in Colombia was particularly brutal. We will be providing just a few of the connections to the armed conflict and the type of domestic violence that is faced every day by women and children in Colombia. So we wanted to warn you in advance of the brutality of some of the examples that you may be hearing. When we started looking at Colombia, and by way of background, by international standards, Colombia has model laws on violence against women that are fully compliant on paper with the CEDAW Convention and Belém do Pará, and compliant with Colombia's human rights constitution. So we were as part of that slide, they include extensive access through the judicial system to civil orders of protection. And Jennifer, I suspect I'm not saying slide loud enough, or is it just the delay?
Sorry, I didn't hear that one.
When I'm saying slide, is it not loud enough for you?
No, no, I didn't catch that one. So is this the right slide?
Nope, it's the next one.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so one of the things that the law does, which best standards say is critical, is provide, and all the research supports, is despite their deficiencies, civil protective orders are vital, and they've gained recognition as a critical remedy for victims of intimate partner violence. They're the fastest and most effective way to deter future violence and provide a position for women that give them extra household leverage of state protection and the threat of punishment. They're issued on a focus of victim safety rather than the perpetrator. And Colombia's laws on civil protective orders have all of the keys that are considered most important. And in Colombia, the entity within the judicial system that's authorized to issue them is not a judge, but family commissioners. But when we started to, and if you go to the next slide, to compare the law to the numbers, we looked in 2016, the year of the landmark peace agreement, and we found that 86% of all violence cases where there were medical judicial services provided consisted of violence against women and girls, 86%. Of these, 73% were perpetrated at home by an intimate male partner. Moreover, women's injuries were serious. 67% were polytraumatic, affecting multiple body systems. Slide. The other thing, if you can move forward with the next slide, that we knew, back one, is that in post-conflict from research, that you can expect in any post-conflict situation an increase in intimate partner violence. The tactics used in the battlefield shift to the home front, and female intimate partners become the central targets. And that's true regardless of affiliation, whether you were fighting for the state, and in the Colombian context, whether it was the government, the FARC, the AUCA, the FLN, anybody who was involved in this brutal conflict, when they demobilized, they would bring their violence home. And because the violence was so brutal in Colombia, they brought that experience with them. What we heard in our interviews is women have been imprisoned in sheds, chained to toilets, hacked with machetes, burned with acid, carved with knives, whipped and branded, and thrown from third-story windows by their intimate partners. Death threats like, "I will cut you into pieces and feed you to the dog," are common. as is holding victims' children at gunpoint. But Colombia, like other nations, did not recognize this link between armed conflict and the terrorism practiced during that conflict and the terrorism practiced at home by all combatants and ex-combatants, regardless of which side of the fight they had been engaged in. The next slide. This is just one of the stories that we heard from a family commissioner who issues protective orders. This commissioner was serving in a municipality in the Andean region, as you can see here, and it exemplifies the intersection between political, family, and gender-based violence. The case concerns 3 brothers that now are aged 15, 19, and 21, whom the FARC recruited when each was 8 years old. The boys remained with the FARC for 5 years. And this recruiting of child soldiers was a very common tactic during the conflict. The mother came to the family commissioner for help after the middle brother told her that his older brother was abusing him sexually. While with the FARC, the oldest boy told an officer that he and others were being sexually abused. The officer lined up the children, took hold of the abuser, cut off his penis, and stuffed it into his mouth. The children, already traumatized by the sexual abuse, were re-traumatized by the sanctions' viciousness. The family commissioner issued a protective order on behalf of the middle brother, who at the time was still a minor. What has happened? The older brother, who was 21 years old at the time of the interview, shortly thereafter was charged and convicted of feminicide after murdering his 16-year-old girlfriend. The youngest brother, who is now 15, remains so traumatized that he cannot control his sphincters. The family commissioner recently placed him under state custody for treatment. The family commissioner noted the extensive press coverage of the feminicide never raised the fact that the murderer and his brothers were victims of violence in the context of the war. Neither the political discourse on political violence, child sexual and other abuse by kin and non-kin, or violence against women, nor the media coverage of the feminicide acknowledged the cycles of violence engendered by the conflict. We verified this account of the family commissioner through newspaper and television reporting. Of course, we're not giving you the name of the municipality or the citations because we want to keep the family commissioner anonymous. And that was one of our promises in our research, that everybody interviewed would remain anonymous. The next slide. Because of the cycle of violences in Colombia needed immediate attention, we, as the city of Medellin, a minister and judicial provider stated, realized that Colombia will not find political peace until we have peace in our homes. Addressing violence against women and intimate partner violence was crucial, and hence was the subject of our research. As the focus of our public scholarship research is Colombia, the approach that we take can be used in other armed conflict contexts. Next slide. Our research project took place over 5 years, and what it sought to do was to understand the practical, legal, institutional, and cultural barriers and facilitators to the Colombia laws implementation from the perspective of judicial providers, to engage with national practitioners and policy leaders to inform the study's design to fit local and national needs, and use the results to advocate for national policy changes internationally at the UN, and then use the results to engage nationally in Colombia with high-level policymakers to promote national policy legislative changes in Colombia. Slide. The approach and design to our research started with the premise that judicial providers and policymakers, who are at the front line of providing access to justice to women victims of violence, know what they need. And then that policymakers can guide research as to what information they need to make policy adjustments. This entailed developing relationships with judicial providers and high-level policy officials. We collected and analyzed data in iterative cycles. We would go back and provide preliminary results to judicial providers and high-level policy officials, which in itself is a form of advocacy. And that would also open the door for further opportunity to collect additional data. And it also helped to gain credibility with them. We then, with advocates' help, advocated internationally with CEDA at the UN. And then through the writing of our book, repainted the data nationally. And we advocated, educated, and engaged with the stakeholders nationally again to try and create change. The next slide. You know, as a research, and Greta as an expert in research methodology, we adopted the principles of rapid assessment process without our research, since it took us 5 years being that rapid. But it entailed conducting interviews with judicial providers, victim advocates, and members of civil society. We conducted 129 interviews, which is an enormous number of interviews for research. And it was clustered into cities with high and low levels of institutional development. The logic of this sampling was to get the best and worst case scenarios so that we could see how the regulatory framework was implemented in the best of circumstances and the worst of circumstances. Interviews with judicial providers were spread across 42 municipalities, representing 17 departments. They included 62 family commissioners, 12 members of their office interdisciplinary teams, because they were backed by social workers, psychologists, assistant lawyers, and secretaries. 8 prosecutors, 6 family judges, 2 vice ministers of justice, among other categories. We also, and this is the part where my legal background was helpful, traced all of Colombia's myriad of domestic violence laws, their decrees, regulations, and then we triangulated that with the interview data and other government reports and commissioner trainings. We also took our own observations from the interviews and our travels throughout the country. And again, it was very useful in this with my own background as a lawyer, and also working with government officials in a legal capacity, and Greta as an anthropologist and an expert in research methodology. The next slide. So let's talk a little bit about who these family commissioners are who issue these vital protective orders. Well, prior to the year 2000, and in 1996, they passed a landmark law where they recognized violence against women as a serious public policy issue, and judges were authorized to issue orders of protection. But as the war raged, they decided that judges had more important things to do. While family commissioners were recognized as the portal to justice to women victims of violence, and they still are, according to the Ministry of Justice, they took the responsibility of issuing protective orders from judges and gave them to family commissioners. Family commissioners were civil servants in the child welfare system who addressed minor family issues, and all of a sudden became part of the judicial system. In essence, the state was demoting the subject of domestic violence against women by taking it away from judges. Nonetheless, the Ministry of Justice continues to say that they are the portal to justice. If you go to the next slide, you will find, and this was one of the points that intrigued us the most, in 2008, Colombia passed this landmark law where it's recognized that women have the right to live a life free of violence. It, is the gold standard, fully compliant with international best practices. It expanded on the earlier protections, and family commissioners have all sorts of responsibilities under it. But as we talk to family commissioners, what we saw is that they were told, and they told us, that we are like Christmas trees. Anything that even remotely has to do with the family or that they cannot place anywhere else, they hang on us. So what happens is family commissioners have excessive responsibilities and they make no sense. Domestic violence and issuing protective orders is just one of a myriad set of responsibilities. And these responsibilities, moreover, in no way are logical. Many of them are inconsistent. And in one case, they're given both powers that are not usually put together. Normally, you don't put police powers together with police prosecutorial powers together with judicial powers. And family commissioners are made responsible for acting as judicial police, while at the same time they have the judicial responsibility of issuing protective orders. Another problem with this Christmas tree of responsibilities, and these are responsibilities put on them at the national level through national laws, is family commissioners, as we'll mention later on, are under the local mayors. That's who they're responsible, to whom they're responsible. And local mayors would even add more responsibilities to them. They're also supposed to have interdisciplinary teams, but 97% of the municipalities follow a legal loophole that allows them to escape the responsibility for having teams to support the family commissioners. So too many responsibilities, they don't have the teams to support them, and the responsibilities that they do have are inconsistent with each other. If you go to the next slide, what we also found out was that in 2006, Colombia had the opportunity to fix things. They were redoing their child and adolescent law, and they had the opportunity to take away a large chunk of responsibilities that didn't belong with the family commissioners. Instead of doing that, they made it worse. And the arrow points to this law, and the color in purple reflects all the additional responsibilities that were added to them. Basically, there's this concept of a family defender under the the Code of Minors law, or the child and adolescence law. And what it says is, when there isn't a family defender in a municipality, then the family commissioner takes over and performs those responsibilities, and without any additional compensation for doing the dual job of family commissioner and family defender. Or calculation, and this is not the exception, but the rule, 80%, 88% of the municipalities in Colombia do not have a child welfare office. That means that family commissioners have to be family defenders in 88% of the country. So as you can see, if you go to the next slide, another factor regarding the family commissioner's office that led us to conclude that they were just an institution designed to fail. There was no way that they could do their job, as they had this impossible institutional structure. In Colombia, as you can see, they've got 3 levels here. There's a municipal level, a departmental level, and a national level. And at the very bottom, you've got the local mayor and municipal council. The family commissioner is directly responsible to the local mayor and council. That's the person who funds them, oversees them. On the other hand, all of their responsibilities are assigned under national law, except when local mayors go rogue, and as we mentioned earlier, start assigning further responsibilities. So just to be clear here, the office of the family commissioner is not part of the judicial branch of the government, which would be the logical place for it if it's a key part of the justice system. And it has no oversight in terms of how it performs its functions by city mayors, the judiciary, the Ministry of Justice, or the National Office of Child Welfare. In essence, what it is each of Colombia's 1,101 family commissioners functions independently in terms of how they interpret the law and apply it. And they're responsible really only to their local mayor, who can decide on their priorities and what they have to do. So as you can see, we looked at this and said, this is crazy. It's designed to fail. If you go to the next slide, the other thing that we decided, if you go to the next slide, that was a characteristic of the structure of the family commissioners and built into the law, was the insufficient number of family commissioner officers.
Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing this particular slide.
Okay, well, it's a really simple point is what we figured out is the number of legally mandated family commissioner offices decreases as population, incidence, and prevalence of domestic violence and service needs increase. I'm not going to go into the details. This is one of our examples on Bogota, but to suffice it to say that it's totally backwards. The more protective orders one area of the city has to process, the fewer family commissioners it has. And there were all sorts of other examples of where the law on the required number of family commissioners was illogical. If you advance to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the advocacy. First of all, it was at the UN, and every 5 years, CEDAW reviews countries that have signed the treaty. They review it against implementation of that treaty, and it provides recommendations. It first of all looks against how the country has implemented prior year's recommendations. It may have certain particular areas of focus, and there's a rigid process that they've adopted over the years for input from stakeholders, civil society, the countries, leading up to a review. If you go to the next slide, you can see that our advocacy strategy for CEDAW developed in large part with the assistance of the advocates, who, because of their consultative status, are really experts in how to address this and guided us through the process, included partnering with them. And the submission of this stakeholder report, which is in the material. And one of the things that you will find is there are very technical rules in terms of what the stakeholder report should say. There are limitations on how long it can be, its format. It's because of advocates' consultative status, we had a little bit more room. But they also have key topics from private years. And so you have to marshal your findings to fit the topics that they want to hear about. Having compelling facts, which we did because of research, and clear recommendations that fall from the facts, I think are very important. They want to know what happens on the grounds. If you go to the next slide, one of the other pieces of the advocacy is a one-pager document that is also an advocate's tool, because the CEDAW committee members are so overwhelmed with information. Having one page that sets forth a few key facts and key recommendations that you distribute both electronically and in paper form to members helps guide them and focus on them, focus on what you have to say, and may encourage them to read your stakeholder report. You also have to coordinate on the ground with other civil society members. There's a small period allowed for interventions, but civil society has to agree how they divide up, who gets to speak, and there's always a limited time, such as one member. Greta, as Colombian, is the most credible person to speak about the on-the-ground findings and to be the voice of Colombian civil society. And she coordinated and found and worked with them and was our presenter during the formal presentations. Another thing that you do is listen very carefully to all the questions by the committee members assigned to review Colombia and from the floor. And based on their interest, you try and respond to questions, providing them with additional information based on your fact finding, writing up in the evening, short emails that give them additional information. And when the state presents, to try and provide additional color where perhaps the state has presented a partial picture of the findings. If you go to the next slide, it really just shows a little bit more of the room where all this action takes place.
Sorry. It's not cooperating into this.
Well, it's just a picture of the room where we work. And as you go forward, we were really just overwhelmed with our success. Part of the CDA process is in their recommendations. They will make 4 recommendations. So you can see on the one side, there's a podium where the group, the CDOC committee members assigned to Colombia lead and ask questions. The other members are in the center of the hall. Others like Jennifer and myself are on the side listening. And if you go forward with the next slide, it will show the civil society formal presentation and Greta doing the formal intervention. But as I was saying, CDOC can give 4 priority recommendations that the country is supposed to implement in 2 years. Whether it does or it doesn't, it's an important mechanism because in 2 years, it provides a basis for CDOT to review progress on the implementation, and it keeps those recommendations at the forefront of it. Specifically, the 2 recommendations that related to the family commissioners and were direct outgrowth of our advocacy were to ensure adequate and sustainable allocation of resources for the implementation of Law 1257, that's the one on violence against women, regarding integrated and accessible services for victims in the rural areas. Consider restructuring the family commissioners under the Ministry of Justice, streamline their mandates, and allocate sufficient human, technical, and financial resources to strengthen them in their work. So this was a major win for us. And if you go to the next slide, we then talk about advocacy on Colombia's law, because they decided that they were going to enact a new law in Colombia addressing some of the problems. Now, this was in the works and not necessarily directly related to our research, but our research was timely in this process. And there was an intergovernmental working group, and the Ministry of Justice invited Greta and I in access to be able to see the draft laws that were coming out before they were public, and to provide comments to the Ministry of Justice, which would then share it with the working group. And what we did was apply the US style painstaking regulatory analysis that had been the hallmark of my training whenever we got a new regulatory proposal. Now, this kind of analysis didn't necessarily go to a regulator, although sometimes it would, but it was always the basis for looking at a proposed piece of legislation. And while it is in Spanish, I can tell you what we did is the columns would, first list the number of our comment. And then the next one is to say the chapter, article, page, and content, where we would list it from the law. The main section is our comments. And then the third, which was unique to the public research that we did, is to cite to our book in Spanish and the data that supported the comments that we were making on the law. And I just took the first page, but for example, and all the lawyers will recognize sort of the detailed comments. And the first one is their table of contents of what the law covers doesn't match the titles of the sections of the law as they subsequently appear, and the numbering is off. So we tell them, typical technical stuff. The next one, when we go into chapter 1, it's they're talking about the mission of the family commissioners. And here we wanted to use it as a point to reinforce the importance of the type of violence that emerges in the family in a post-conflict situation. So of course we're saying, we applaud the explicit effort to combat violence within the family, and to make explicit that that is the mission of the family commissioners. It would be important to identify in this section that in the context of a post-conflict, that violence tends to move into the home, and its incidence in terms of violence against an intimate partner and children will increase. And we give examples. Later on, we have many more very explicit recommendations. For us, though, we were always on the outside of what was going on. We provided all of this. We could see in some subsequent iterations of the law that some of our recommendations were being adopted, but it really was an black box. We never really knew what the negotiations were or how we were influencing them. And Greta did a brilliant job of being the voice and the interface with the Ministry of Justice and others. If you go to the next slide,
Keep talking and I will.
Yeah, well, we did have success. Eventually, the law is submitted to Congress in July 2020, and on August 4th, 2021, Law 2126, which amends one of the laws on violence against women, 294 of 1996, is issued. If you keep going forward, we'll talk a little bit about what the law does. And there were successes and there were some failures. One of the successes is that it removed many of the responsibilities of family commissioners not connected to the central mission of protecting against domestic violence. It also explicitly prohibits mayors from assigning additional responsibilities. Those are the items in light blue that have a big cross. And family commissioners no longer have to conduct non-binding mediation on matters related to custody support and visitation unless they're directly related to a protective order. These are big wins because they were two responsibilities that were a huge time sink. And they also address the recommendations from CEDA. if you go to the next slide, we provided, you've gone too far. There's one back. We provided all sorts of information about why family commissioners should not also be family defenders. On that, we lost. And of course, you can't win on everything. It would have been hugely expensive, and there's just not enough money or will in the system to do that. So we lost that. Family commissioners are still family defenders in the 88% municipalities where there is no family defender existing under the child welfare system. If you now go to the next slide, where we had talked about how impossible the institutional structure was, and it was designed to fail, we made some progress. The Ministry of Justice is given additional responsibility. We didn't get the family commissioners moved from the local mayors and municipalities. They still are under them. But it is more formally recognized that they are responsible to the Ministry of Justice in certain circumstances. And at least, and we had argued this as a fallback position, that the Ministry of Justice had to be given power to discipline mayors who didn't provide the sufficient resources, because again, the money comes from the local mayors. It doesn't come directly from the national government. And to hold them accountable if they started giving family commissioners additional responsibilities or didn't give them interdisciplinary support personnel that they needed to run their office efficiently. So there are still all sorts of things wrong with the institutional structure, but it's a step forward. So if you go forward with the slide, what we can say is that our advocacy definitely made a difference. Like most advocacy, it's a process. You don't get perfection. But we're very hopeful that and the other point is we increase the number of family commissioner offices per 1,000 inhabitants, as well as tying it more to incidence and service demand. So it is now a more rational set of criteria to determine how many family commissioners there must be. So that also is a success. Now, there's an implementation period for all these changes to come online. And it's one thing to have a law. It's another thing to see how it's implemented in practice. But without this project and the research that Dr. Friedemann Sanchez and I did, and the facts that we produced, we are confident that the changes that hopefully will improve the lives of women and families in Colombia, as well as those in the judicial system, particularly the family commissioners and the psychosocial teams that are supposed to provide support to them, are improved, or hopefully improved, as a consequences of the changes that are reflected in the law as the result of what we learned on the ground. And as a result of what we learned from Jennifer and the advocates on how to effectively advocate in the UN system.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peggy. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point, and we will take a few questions. And I just want to emphasize how this is such an incredible success story to me. You know, the Advocates has a long experience with doing UN advocacy, and it was a pleasure to really to work so closely with Greta and Peggy. But to think about, you know, 2015 is when they started this research, and being able to get that really to get the documentation of the problems, and then to be able to communicate that to the international community at the highest level, and make specific and concrete recommendations for change. You know, I saw them at work at the Human Rights Council. We first went there in 2018, and then again at the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's just like the way it was presented, and then having that concrete information and the concrete recommendations. It was just hugely effective. And I've never seen a treaty body give two out of the four priority recommendations for the government to respond to within, you know, within 2 years were on this issue. So let's start out with a question. Greta, if you're feeling up to it, what surprised you the most about doing this research and participating in this advocacy?
Thank you. And thank you, Peggy, for presenting on both of our behalves. I think two things surprised me the most. And of course, I'm an academic, and even though, as you heard Peggy say presenting, even though I'm committed and have always been committed to applied research, I'm still an academic. And so I've being siloed in academia, and being siloed, I mean, even though I've been working in international development, and I have been working on women's issues and gender and development, and knowledgeable about human rights, really never applying the international mechanisms. So that surprised me. So being grateful for your teaching of how to apply the mechanisms once one does the research, and then how effective it was. So that surprised me. So I'm just echoing what you just said, right? Of the two of the four observations, it was like, oh my God. So that was surprising, but it was also surprising because it was the power of research. If you have the data and how you can put the data to work in a way that is beyond the peer-reviewed publication, and how when you tie yourself in a collaboration, which is right here, you can see it visually. It's a collaboration with Peggy and I, right? It's very interdisciplinary. Neither of us would have been able to do the project without each other. And then it's the collaboration between the advocacy with you, Jennifer, and with Advocates for Human Rights, and how one can take that and just make it fly. And that really surprised me. And the third thing that surprised me was, you know, knowing that, yes, we wanted, from the very beginning, I knew that we wanted to repatriate the data to Colombia. And we were ready because we also wrote the project, if we wrote the report in English. So we had the version of the book in English. So it's kind of like a, not exactly of the Spanish version in English, because we thought, okay, that is not going to be enough to go and do the advocacy in Colombia. We're going to have to go again to other international audiences to push further. And it surprised me how effective we were in Colombia. So it was like, wow, once it took, it took. So that visual of the presentation in the beginning that is like this, all of a sudden it was like a hurricane. It was like a whirling that had its own momentum.
Great, thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Peggy?
Oh, there were so many surprises along the way that were just fascinating. I don't think I'll add any. I think for me, one of the things that was really interesting was working with all the different groups in the Colombian government and seeing how often they kept changing and sort of the challenge um, the that we had just over 5 years. But if you think of the advocates within the country, it's almost as though you have to reestablish yourself all the time. It's not like in the US, where frequently you have the civil service that stays the same. Um, and you can continue to see those people. There may be some who change, but this was like on a regular basis that you get support, and then the person who was supporting you and opening doors all of a sudden disappeared, and the next person was like, never heard of you. What were you doing? If you were doing it with that person, no way. So it was a very interesting process. The other thing that was very interesting to me as a lawyer is Colombia has done all sorts of innovative things about citizen participation in government and transparency when it actually publishes a law for comment. But by the time it publishes a law for comment, it's already decided a lot of the things. So that intergovernment working group on putting the law together, none of that process is transparent. Okay, I understand that. A lot of the initial drafting and working at the the Fed or the SEC, institutions that I know, is not transparent. But the process, once they publish, is very iterative and inviting with civil society, and there can be lots of changes. In Colombia, the so-called you don't, a lot of the work goes on in this drafting with different groups, and you have no idea what's happening. And we were so fortunate, even though we didn't know what was happening, just to be able to comment on the laws and to have input there. But once they're out, the involvement of civil society, even though it appears to be there, really is not. So that was fascinating to me as well.
Interesting. So that sort of relates a little bit to one of the questions, and thank you, Greta, for answering one of the previous questions in the chat. But there's a question in the chat about the importance of civil society groups in implementing the law. Did you work with any of the advocacy groups in Colombia? Did you share your findings with any of them? Greta, if you want to comment on that.
So we repatriated the information. Part of the grant that we got from the university was to print the book. So we printed 1,500 copies of the book, physical print. And then we have an e-version of the book. And what we did with those 1,500 copies was to actually redistribute them, not only to individuals that had interviewed with us, and some of those were civil society, but to individuals from civil society, from organizations and individuals that we did not meet, but that we know are part of civil society in Colombia that are involved with these issues. So yes, we distributed that, and the ebook is also part of we distributed it.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're over time.
Yes.
So let me just ask you one more question, and then we'll wrap up. But I'm sure people would love to hear from you a little advice. what tools can individuals who are interested in human rights use to make change? Greta, do you have thoughts on how people,
Yes.
how people can change human rights in their country?
I think one very powerful tool is the methodological tool of qualitative methods, of having strong design tools. Well, how to do strong research design, meaning sampling, how to do strong sampling, because that means you can do strong data collection, writing a strong interview guide, and then you have the data, the evidence to back up your claim, to synthesize a lot of information like we did for the UN, and to write a very strong stakeholder report with your guidance, and to then present it and say, this is based on this methodology. It doesn't only represent an anecdote, right? This is a sample. It is very representative. It has saturation. So I think the power of qualitative data is superb for human rights. And it is it's a tool. It's a tool to save lives. So yes.
Yes, and that's absolutely what the two of you have done in Colombia to better protect women and children from violence. So thank you so much for that. That's a
Thank you.
great way to celebrate International Women's Day. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this free CLE. If you would like to support the advocates for human rights, women's human rights work around the world, you can also join us tomorrow on March 8th at 7 p.m. That's a virtual fundraiser in celebration of International Women's Day 2022. One Woman, One Country, One World. And so we'll put that link in the chat. You can also text Women's, WOMENS, to 44321 or click on the link in the chat to give. But I just want to say thank you again so much to Greta and to Peggy for being with us here today and sharing your experience and your knowledge. And thanks so much to everyone else for being here with us and for being part of the human rights movement. So thank you and have a
Thank
great
you.
International Women's Day.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, bye-bye.